Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this week's edition of Guyana's Oil and You.
May the blessings of God never leave your shore.
All right, so I'll get started on that again. My apologies, we were experiencing some technical difficulties.
Of course, I can't hear you guys.
Just now.
Kiana, go ahead without me.
We can't go ahead without you, Annette.
Well, I'm now hearing you, but for some reason it's not allowing me to use my camera. This is my
Okay, so Miss Arjun, you're still there? Okay, so what we'll try to do is we'll try to get Miss Arjun via call because she is really important to the discussion tonight. So I'll just pass her number on to our guys here in Kaieteur Radio, and they're going to try and get her on the line for us. In the meantime, let's get started with the introductions for tonight's program. This is this week's edition of Guyana's Oil and You, and I'm your hostess as usual, editor at Kaieteur News, Kiana Wilburg. And tonight we are discussing oil and the environment, a very important topic that's not given the spotlight as often as it should. To discuss this very important matter tonight, we have three key stakeholders: Mr. Christopher Ram, chartered accountant and lawyer. We also have another lawyer on the panel, Miss Melinda Janke, and we have the ever so ardent speaker on matters in relation to the environment, Miss Annette Arjun. She's not with us at the moment, but we're going to try our best to get on to her. She's experiencing some technical difficulties on her end, but we will definitely have her part of the discussion at some point in time. In the meantime, I'd like to get started with opening remarks from the two individuals that we have here who are no strangers to the Guyana Oil and You program. So I'd like to start with Mr. Christopher Ram, sir. Your opening statement on ExxonMobil's performance since production started offshore and your impression of how the PPPC government has approached protecting the environment.
Thank you very much. And I feel honored to share a panel with all these distinguished ladies. It's clearly been a troubled initiation into our petroleum production. We've had so many problems with flaring, compressor. We have no new legislation. That's absolutely disgraceful. Absolutely disgraceful. We cannot get the Petroleum Commission to operate. So what we have, politicians are running everything. We have the funds, the Natural Resource Fund is stuck in the Bank of America, earning nothing or next to nothing, whilst there's so many things that we can do. I would say that we are really badly lacking in governance, legislative framework, accounting, transparency, disclosure, you name it. We really do have a lot of problems. And at some stage, you think, when will it become all worthwhile? And some people might say never. But those are my opening comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ram. Ms. Janke, I'll turn the floor over to you. Your opening remarks regarding the performance of ExxonMobil offshore and how the PPPC government has approached protecting the environment.
Good evening, Kiana. Thanks for having me back, and good evening to all your viewers and listeners. I think it's quite clear that ExxonMobil's performance, 120 miles offshore Guyana, is extremely dangerous. Deep water drilling is very dangerous at the best of times, and what we're seeing is a company that is not using faulty equipment, That's very dangerous. We're seeing a company that is not apparently not following manufacturers' procedures. That's extremely dangerous. And this poses a grave threat to Guyana. Now, people sometimes say, oh, it's the environment. Of course, it's the environment. And the point that people need to grasp is that the environment has a value. That's what it says in the Constitution, that the well-being of the nation depends on preserving clean air, fertile soils, pure water, and rich biodiversity. So it's nonsense, for example, to say smash down the mangroves because we need development. That sort of mentality belongs to a different century. Exxon's performance poses a serious, present, grave, increasing danger to Guyana, to the Guyanese people, and to the Guyanese economy. I don't think that anybody should be saying, well, we need development. What we require is benefits to the people of this country and sustainable development, which means protecting the environment for future generations. And that is also in the Constitution. And that is something that Chris mentioned last week. And I'm really glad that he raised that, because that's a forgotten provision of the Constitution. The Constitution is the supreme law of this land. Secondly, leaving aside for the moment that this extremely dangerous operation by ExxonMobil, we have the behavior of the current administration, which is not an improvement on the last administration. This is grossly irresponsible behavior. We are not seeing them enforcing the law, and the law is there to be enforced. There's no law that permits flaring. The EPA does not have the power to permit flaring. The permit was granted on the basis of an environmental impact assessment that says that there will not be routine flaring and that there is minimal damage from flaring. So we have a system in place, and the laws of this country are being flouted. We have an administration that has been grossly irresponsible and gambling with the future of this country. Coming back to Chris's point about the Natural Resources Fund, that is illegal. It was supposedly signed into law by David Granger at a time when he was not president. And the Caribbean Court of Justice is quite clear on this. Once you have a no confidence motion and the government loses, you move on to a different situation. He was not president at the time, and therefore he could not sign it. And I have written to the Attorney General pointing that out to him. So the Natural Resources Fund legislation was not passed in accordance with the Constitution, and it needs to be redone. And again, I'm glad that Chris raised this point about the Natural Resources Fund. So in summary, we have an extremely dangerous operation 120 miles offshore. The government is not enforcing the law, and the Environmental Protection Agency, which is a state agency, is behaving in a grossly irresponsible manner when it comes to enforcing the law that would stop the flaring and that would require Exxon to obey the laws of Guyana and to carry out the terms of its permit. I also think that modification is illegal, but we can come back to that.
Yes, definitely. Thank you very much for your opening remarks. And Ms. Annette Arjun-Martins, you've joined us right on time to have your opening remarks. And the opening that we have is basically on the performance, your initial thoughts on the performance of ExxonMobil offshore Guyana and how you view the performance of the PPPC government in approaching the protection of the environment. And I think that your perspective is definitely going to be unique for us because you're also not just a environmentalist, but you're also head of the Guyana Marine Conservation Society. So I'm really interested in hearing how that body also views the performance of ExxonMobil offshore.
Well, sorry about having problems signing in Kiana. I'm not sure what happened there. And sorry to have missed what Chris and Melinda would have mentioned.
Yes.
But in terms of my opinion on the performance of ExxonMobil, it's very clear to me that their inability to manage their flaring issues over almost a year and a half, going on to 2 years, is deeply worrying. Deeply worrying for me because when they were heralded as being for oil operations,
Annette, we're
this what seems to be an
sorry to
insurmountable
interrupt you,
problem
Annette.
with the
We
gas
we sort of
compressor.
missed you there. Could you just go back to the point you're saying that when they were heralded, we sort of missed your comments there due to some technical difficulties there. Annette, are you still with us? Annette?
Kiana, yeah, I'm here, but you're freezing.
Okay.
So, in a nutshell, I'm saying that Exxon's inability to resolve their almost 2 years of flaring leaves me deeply worried as to their ability to manage an oil spill, for example. That
All right. We seem to not be getting through to Miss Arjun there. Miss Arjun, are you still with us? Okay, so what
I'm here,
we'll do.
Kiana, go ahead with others.
Okay, so
Let
what
me move
we'll
into another
do.
room and see if it makes a difference.
What we'll do is we'll call you directly, Miss Arjun, so that we can have a very clear line. I'll have the guys here make a call to you right now so that we can have some clarity moving forward.
Okay.
All right, thanks so much. So, Chris, I just want to go back to part of your opening remarks. All right, let's see if we can.
Hello.
Hi, Miss Arjun, you can hear us?
Very loud and clear.
Perfect. So, yes, let's continue the discussion. So, I was just going back to Chris's point that he made earlier about the fact that there's no new legislation. 6 years into having found oil, we are yet to revise our environmental laws. Mr. Rahman, I'd like to put this question to other members of the panel, but I'll start with you. Does this signal to you that we are not prioritizing transparency and accountability in protecting the environment, holding ExxonMobil accountable, given how we have seen in many instances around the world how dangerous oil production can be when it comes to the environment? It's a very delicate balance that one has to manage. And in the absence of laws, it can, of rigid laws actually, it can be a very dangerous thing to play with. How do you view the fact that we're 6 years in and nothing has been done where this is concerned?
Well, 6 years sounds little when you think that the existing legislation on petroleum was in 1985. So we're talking of close to 36 years to an industry that has clearly evolved. You raise a question about accountability. I think it's more than that. I believe this is all very deliberate. I don't think the politicians are particularly keen on governance. They can negotiate, as Robert Persaud used to do, as Raphael Trotman used to do, and with absolutely no oversight or accountability. Now, if we had a functioning petroleum commission, we would not be arguing now about audits. We would not be arguing about flaring. So many things we would have taken care of. But my view is that these omissions are absolutely deliberate. We recall the PPP itself. It signed a 1999 agreement and it never, ever, ever disclosed it. It gave a series of waivers on relinquishments to ExxonMobil. And it never, ever disclosed that. You would have to go looking in SO Exploration and Production Guyana Limited accounts, financial statements for several years to realize how tolerant and permissive our governments have been. The SO came in, they got massive acreages, bigger than the entire Guyana. Let's put that in context. Never once in 21 years has it been called upon to give up a single hectare or acre. Not once. When time came for giving it up, we waived the requirement. Now, the way they're going about this helter-skelter exploration and production is so that forever they will have total control of a size of oil blocks that is bigger than Guyana. Think of that. So one almost has to lose, not confidence now. Confidence has been lost ever since. But one loses faith that there's any effort. And this modified environmental permit, and you might come up with the long and meaningless statement issued by the EPA early this afternoon and condemning, who is it? Condemning the political, the legal, and the technical pundits.
Yes.
I'm not sure which of the two ladies they're referring to. It is so irresponsible, and they forget Article 13, they forget Article 149C. We just don't care. And I think we have a case now where Guyana is ruled by SO as the operator on behalf of the other two companies, S and CNOOC. That's where we are. There is nothing. The president has indicated, our parliament hardly meets anymore, apparently. That's no longer, parliament is not critical anymore. And parliament is one of the most important institutions in Guyana. So, as I said, you don't only lose confidence, but you lose faith.
Thank you very much. Ms. Janke, I'll turn to you now, and this is where I would not only ask you to provide your take on the fact that we are yet to revise our environmental laws, but I'd like to bring the issue of the flaring charge that was recently introduced by the EPA for flaring. How do you view that in light of the existing legislation? Because the EPA is arguing, and even up to its latest statement that it issued earlier today, that the charge of $30 for every ton of carbon dioxide equivalent that's flared after May 13, it's saying that that's in keeping with the law. But how do you view that? Because you would have said that it's not part of the legislation to flare. The law does not allow for flaring.
I think the EPA is talking nonsense on a number of levels, but and I will explain why. But first, I want to knock on the head this excuse of, well, the law hasn't been changed, we need to change it. People need to read the Environmental Protection Act and use it. And I disagree fundamentally with Chris on this, because the act is actually very strong. The problem is it's not being applied and it's not being used. Dr. Adams, when he was head of the EPA, he used it, and he took a very strong position on certain issues. The EPA is not doing their duty, and people in this country are not forcing the EPA to do their duty. I want to remind you of Article 9 of the Constitution, which says that sovereignty belongs to the people. who exercise it through their representatives and democratic organs. Now, the elected representatives are servants. They are our servants. They are not leaders. They're not leaders that we follow. They are servants elected to serve the interests of the people of this country. But when they don't do that, and clearly they're not doing that, there's no point sitting around and complaining. The point then is to make sure that you call them to account and you use the law and you tell them to do their duty. And if they don't do it, you go to court and you use the law that is here and you ask the judiciary to enforce that law and you ask for legal remedies. But sitting around complaining endlessly and saying we need to change the law is not going to get us anywhere whatsoever. In terms of the petroleum legislation, I agree completely with Chris. That is way out of date. It's 1985. It was imposed on this country but through a World Bank loan, and the World Bank have been involved in petroleum in this country since the very beginning. And there is not a single project on this earth that the World Bank has supported in relation to oil and gas that has been a success. We've asked them, show us where you have had a success. They can't do it. Every single World Bank project has benefited the oil company and impoverished the country. You only have to look at the Chad-Cameroon pipeline, the oil gas to shore project in Guyana, the disaster that is unfolding in Mozambique, etc., etc., etc. So let's be very careful when people are coming into this country to tell us that we need to change our laws, because they have vested interests. That's why they hired ExxonMobil's lawyers under the World Bank project to try and change the Environmental Protection Act. We said to the World Bank, what's wrong with the Environmental Protection Act? Show us your report. They won't show it to us because they can't justify changing the act. Now, in terms of this purported modification by the EPA, this is very silly. They're saying that they're using the polluter pays principle. Let me read out to you the polluter pays principle, because I think that the average listener and the average viewer will apply common sense. The polluter pays principle says the polluter should bear the cost of measures to reduce pollution decided upon by public authorities, to ensure that the environment is in an acceptable state, and to compensate citizens for the harm they suffer from pollution. The cost of measures to reduce pollution. Charging them $30 for a ton of greenhouse gas does not reduce pollution. The pollution is still going up into the atmosphere. The plain language of the principle set out in the legislation is that you must reduce pollution. That means you tell ESSO you cannot flare. Your permit does not allow you to flare incidentally. And when they got the permit, they undertook to re-inject the gas. So there's no possibility that they are allowed to flare. You are told, you said you're going to re-inject the gas. Well, you must re-inject the gas and you must spend whatever is necessary to ensure that you are not polluting the atmosphere by flaring. It's that simple. We don't need, and I love Chris's description of it, this long, meaningless statement from the EPA, to convince a public that will not be convinced, because the ordinary woman and man and trans in this country knows perfectly well that the EPA is not doing its job and is not enforcing the law and is not applying the polluter pays principle. And I don't know why they're referring to the American Petroleum Institute, which has absolutely no standing in this country, doesn't make law. It's an industry body. It's got absolutely nothing to do with Guyana. The EPA's job is to enforce the law and to apply the polluter pays principle and tell ESSO Exploration and Production Guyana Limited to stop flaring because they're not allowed to flare, and because they said that they would not flare. They said that there will be non-routine and temporary flaring, i.e. during select maintenance activities. So what they said was routine and temporary, non-routine and temporary just means during maintenance activities. And don't tell me anything about startup, because you can't be starting up for 18 months. So this provision on startup makes absolutely no sense. This is a modification that, in my opinion, has no basis in law.
Thank you very much. Ms. Annette, you're still with us?
Yeah, I'm here, Kiana.
Thank you. So when you first heard that the EPA had modified the Liza Phase 1 environmental permit following discussions with ExxonMobil, how did you feel about that as an environmentalist and as the head of the Guyana Marine Conservation Society?
Well, look, we're all aware of what the problems are, right? So, I mean, first, I think we need to also look at the solutions. And in the context of listening to what Melinda said earlier, I want to touch on some of that as well. Mm-hmm. When I saw that the Environmental Protection Agency had modified the permit, I thought that, okay, at least the EPA is trying to address the flaring in some form, albeit not the preferred form, in terms of giving Exxon a license to flare, because the fine is clearly minimal compared to what their production profits are on a daily basis. So if you looked at, for example, the cost that they have incurred with their 16 billion cubic feet of flaring to date, that is roughly around $26.3 million US dollars, right? Mm-hmm. Their average flaring is 15.9 million cubic feet, and that's 1,150 tons of CO2. If their fine at the $30 a ton is applied to that, it works out to them paying a fine of between 25 to 33,000 US dollars a day, and they have ramped up their production to 120,000 barrels of oil, which at the going rate of $50 a barrel works out to 6 million US. So in this case, even with the modified permit that fines them $30 a ton, they're still making a 5.9 million US dollar profit. So it becomes profitable to pollute. So I would want to focus on the on protocols to stop the flaring completely, and it's inexcusable. After 18 months, they cannot seem to get their faulty compressor fixed. And to be quite frank, when I saw the revised environmental permit one day, and then Exxon's public relations stated the next day that the gas compressor would be fixed in June, quite frankly, we've been told that 3 times already. So that statement that it will be fixed in June doesn't hold any water anymore. I will believe it when I see it. And coming back to Melinda's point about the polluter pays principle, for example, I also want to remind everyone about Article 149J that speaks to us Guyanese right to environment that's not harmful to our health. And the fact that Exxon has polluted our environment for 18 months and counting, they also need to really pay as a polluter. And I think this is where we should be looking at compensation as well for their pollution retroactively. So if you go back to the cost of their pollution to date, 26 million US dollars, they should really be, required to atone by supporting, for example, mangrove restoration and management substantially, and make sure it's part of their annual plan as well. So, I mean, that is my statement in terms of your question. I do want to say that when I saw the EPA release this afternoon, 2 things jumped out to me. That they mentioned that they're going to be working on national standards, and they're also looking at specific flaring targets. But I would prefer we go back to the original intent, which was to not have any flaring at any cost. So let's see what happens going forward, and I will stop there.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask the lawyers on the panel a question. Have we, or not have we, but has the EPA really shot itself in the foot by moving to put a charge, and quite a low one, for flaring when the law does not permit something like this? Can the EPA be taken to court for something like this?
Yes, of course they can. The decision to modify that permit is not based on law. They are relying on Regulation 14, which says that you can't modify the permit to create an additional adverse effect. Well, obviously, if you're not supposed to flare, and then suddenly you're allowed to flare, but you pay a pittance of $30 a barrel, that is an adverse effect. I think the point that the EPA has missed, and the point that economists miss and continue to miss and are determined to miss, is that the law does not allow you to grant a license to pollute. The polluter pays principle in the Environmental Protection Act is not a license to pollute. It is an instruction that says you must stop polluting, and whatever it costs you to stop polluting, that is what you pay. Polluter pays is not a license to pollute. And the EPA doesn't seem to understand that. And the economists that have been advising them also don't seem to understand that. And this is a very dangerous situation. Annette mentioned Article 149J, which says that the people of Guyana have a right to a healthy environment. The EPA has to take into account the impact on the environment when they do these things, including, and the environment includes the climate and the atmosphere. What you have here is a contribution to climate change. This country is very vulnerable to climate change. What you have with the emission of greenhouse gases is increasing ocean acidification. Our fisheries depend on a healthy ocean. What you have is an oil company that is emitting greenhouse gases that it is not permitted to emit, and an environmental protection agency that seems to think that a pittance of $30 per ton is sufficient to damage the climate and to damage the ocean and to put this country even more at risk from the existential threat that is climate change. And this is grossly irresponsible. The EPA has no power to do that. This amendment is probably unconstitutional, as well as being unauthorized under the Environmental Protection Act, as well as being contrary to the regulations that they cite in support of the purported modification. So yes, of course, they can be taken to court on this.
Mr. Ram, what are your thoughts?
Well, we keep coming back to 149J.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to make this point just to emphasize that the state has a duty, shall protect the environment for the benefit of present and future generations. I think that's extremely important. I'm not sure to prevent pollution and ecological degradation, to promote conservation and to secure sustainable development. Now, the mangrove is clearly ecological degradation, but I don't know that the bishop read this. This business, so the statement that the EPA issued on the day of the modified environmental permit is an admission of pollution. So I think it has shot itself in the foot. I also want to raise this question. The EPA had this long statement today. It didn't deal with the facts. It didn't deal with the statements that people are saying. Look, what you are doing is allowing the pollution. You're now giving form to a very bad practice. But I would like them to say this. Apart from the point I raised in a letter I did today, all this permissive to do things insofar as is possible, that's not how you deal with the environment. And where possible, and as practicable. That's what the EPA has done. So who measures this? But I want to ask one fundamental question. Would the EPA tell us what the figure was that the technical team came up with, was it not closer to $100? And it buckled to Exxon. It was, so this business about $30, the EPA needs to be honest. Now, when I was talking about legislation, I differ with, I don't believe. I believe the EPA Act is itself in need. You see, you can just move as an executive and as happened with Vincent Adams. I don't think that should happen. I also think we should have proper, or even under the EPA, we have no regulations, we have no orders published under the EPA dealing with the petroleum sector. There is in relation to the broader issue of the environment, but there's nothing in relation to the petroleum sector. And that's the kind of updating I was talking about. I don't disagree, and of course, Melinda is free to challenge what I say. I welcome that, but I was referring to the Petroleum Exploration and Production Act. I was referring to the Petroleum Exploration and Production regulations. And I am referring as well to other legislation, because I do not believe the kind of cavalier manner in which the EPA and its head can be moved and removed. I don't think that's good. I think we need, as you know, Melinda was talking about Article 9. We need to give more teeth to some of these important bodies, and the EPA in this current arrangement, whether our destruction of the environment is in relation to petroleum, forestry, gold, bauxite, water, the EPA needs to be far more responsible and competent, and not be so thin-skinned as to not take on board comments that are legitimate, comments that are made by citizens of this country who have an absolute right, a constitutional right. And for the EPA to come out with that statement that they did today, I think does them a great disservice, and quite frankly, it's shocking. But let's not cloud it into this. I would like you, Kiana, as one of our leading journalists, ask them what is the number that was arrived at for this business where they put $30. What was the number? I'd like them to say that.
All right.
And I'd like you to get that information.
Well, you can rest assured that right after this program has concluded, I will be sending that question over to the acting head of the EPA to investigate that piece of information that you passed on to us. But I'm really grateful for the comments that we've had here, and I would love to move on to another matter which has to do with the energy transition and where that leaves Guyana. Reason being for this particular topic coming on board right now is that the International Energy Agency released a bombshell report this week which states that if we're really to get to net zero carbon emissions by 2050, then no new oil and gas projects should be pursued. Now, that is in stark contrast to what's going on in Guyana and the ambitions, the exploration ambitions and programs of ExxonMobil offshore Guyana. Ms. Janke, I'd like to start with you, and then I'll go over to Ms. Annette. How do you view this report and the path that Guyana is taking?
Thanks, Kiana. I just want to endorse two comments from Chris. One,
Sure.
he's absolutely right about the unacceptable level of political interference in the operations of the EPA. And secondly, he's also absolutely right about the need for updated petroleum legislation. And I think that needs to happen sooner rather than later. It's the industry specific or the sector specific law that is really, really defective, because the Environmental Protection Act is an umbrella thing. The regulations for this petroleum sector come under the act, and he's absolutely right. The Petroleum Exploration and Production Act is is way out of date, gives far too much power to ministers and not enough accountability. In terms of the International Energy Agency report, what is really a bombshell is that it's the IEA that is saying it.
Yes.
This is an organization that was set up to protect the fossil fuel industry of the United States, the United Kingdom, Europe, etc. It was set up for the energy security of those countries, and it was a response to the attempts by countries in the Middle East to take control of fossil fuels, take control basically of the oil supply. And the IEA has always been, in effect, a spokesperson for the fossil fuel sector, for promoting it. Nothing has changed. The science has not changed. We've known for a long time now that fossil fuels are on their way out and that they're killing the planet. We've known for a long time that to meet the Paris 1.5 degrees, to stay within that limit, which is ecocidal, but that's another issue. But just to stay within the bare minimum of the Paris Agreement, there is already overproduction in the fossil fuel sector. So we have already known that nothing has changed. What has changed is the Biden administration has said that climate change is an existential threat, and that has freed up the International Energy Agency now to go with the science and to go with the market, because the market has already left the fossil fuel sector behind. That's why ExxonMobil is half the size today. It's half the size that it was a few years ago.
Yes.
And that's why its credit rating has been downgraded twice. The really shocking thing for Guyana is that our politicians are willfully blind to market forces and willfully blind to the science. And there is a very strong possibility that 9 billion barrels of oil offshore Guyana is already stranded assets, because there's no point taking it out.
Okay. Thank you very much. Mr. Ram, you're still there? I'm seeing your video. Okay, you're still with us.
Yes,
Ms.
I'm still
Arjun? Ms. Arjun?
I think her audio is giving problems.
Hi, Kiana, I'm here.
Okay, so did you hear my question earlier, or would you like me to go it over one more time?
I heard a question, but I just want to say, though, Kiana, that one of the things we should look at as well is the renewal of the Lisa 1 permit, which is going to be due very soon.
Yes, June 1.
Gives us a real opportunity to correct a lot of what we know needs to be corrected. And I have no doubt that, there will be efforts in that regard. So I wanted to basically say that. And then in terms of what Melinda has just stated in terms of the IEA being basically a fossil fuel lobbyist, as I understand the API to be as well. The reality is, look, Chris and I have seen when over 2,000 sugar workers were made redundant a couple of months before Christmas, and he actually single-handedly led a donation drive to go and help some of those families out. I saw firsthand the deprivation that resulted as a consequence of the parents not even being able to give their children the bus fare to go to school, and the amount of kids that dropped out and the subsequent punishment that they endured. So I'm very cognizant that we must have a way of balancing economic development with environmental protection and mitigation to where there have to be some give. So in terms of the IEA report, which is basically saying there must be a stop to new gas development and oil development, I want to say that, we will have to be very careful going forward, because I could see very clearly where, for example, even if you look at the opportunities in Region 3, where a lot of people are still unemployed, there's no other sectors at the moment that could absorb the high level of unemployment we have. This morning I participated in meeting with the UN and gender, where the figures they were using in terms of unemployment, I think it was like 51%. I mean, that's staggering. So, and we have seen as well too the increase in crime, and a lot of it being by people who don't necessarily they're getting a lot of the petty ones especially. So we really have to be very pragmatic and look at how do we balance that going forward.
Thank you very much, Ms. Annette. Mr. Ram, I'd also like to pose the same question to you and to have your thoughts on the report and examining what it's recommending with Guyana moving aggressively to monetize its oil and gas resources.
Well, of course, the government has used the very thinking that, look, at some point, the fossil fuel will become something of the past. And therefore, we really ought to be drilling as much as we can, despite all the economic consequences, despite the Dutch disease, despite the resource curse. So we're not seeing all of those things. We have a situation where we have starvation wages. We're supposed to be this big, fantastic world leader in GDP, and we pay starvation wages. Why do you think people do not want to work? The unemployment figure also reflects the fact that the private sector is not coming up to the plate with the plate. They are not paying money. Now, on this issue of the AEA report,
Yes.
Guyana has a very tough decision to make. Look, Norway, we love to talk about Norway, Trinidad, China, India, USA. All these countries have exploited their natural resources. We have belatedly discovered natural resources. What that dilemma we face. Look, I would love to see us get out of it. Maybe we can get, if we can get a project like we did with the Norwegian LCDS, where they said, hold on, preserve your assets, we will pay you. But we need money for development as well. And when I talk of development, I am not talking about the bishop's development. I'm talking about people's development. I'm talking about welfare for single mothers, where they can go, they don't have to decide even if I want to go to work, what happened with my children. We have none of these things. You have parallel healthcare systems, you have parallel education system, you have parallel security, you have parallel almost everything. And we talk about development. Do they know what development is? Some of those people got armed guards and all of these things all the time. They don't know what the masters do. They don't know how people live. So I understand, I truly understand. Melinda, I was talking with Anand Gulsaran, the persons I respect. They are on the side of we should stop. I may very well find that I'm on the wrong side of history. I don't think, as a practical matter, we will stop now. Would I like to see us stopping? Of course I will. But how do we get money? What do we do? So we do this partly for ourselves and partly for the world. Who bears the cost? And I think that's a philosophical discussion that we need to have. We were prepared to do it for forestry. Why not oil? Is it that we have sold ourselves to the Americans since 1999 when Janet Jagan did what she did with that agreement? And we're talking about correction of anomalies and so on, June 1 and all. That is not so. Everything is guided by the 2016 agreement. And you cannot do anything harmful to the economic interests of the oil companies under the 2016 agreement without compensating them. And this is an issue that we also, people say, oh, we're getting this money, getting nothing. Because look at the stability clause. It says you have to compensate them. And in columns I've written, and no one, the EPA has suddenly has heard their voices, that's good. We've said that even on environmental matters, if you affect,
You've gone on to mute, Chris.
if you affect the economics of their operations, you have to compensate them.
Yes.
That's what is written in the agreement. We have this serious conversation. Unfortunately, the government is not willing. Government has 34 seats in the national, 33 plus one, I think, in the National Assembly. We're not getting a say. And thanks to people like you, thanks to Kaieteur News, that we can mention. But as I said, I am not ready to go as far as Melinda and I know Anand to say stop without certain conditions. Yes, we're prepared to. How do we get money to raise our standards? We discovered oil perhaps at the wrong time, but there's no question. Fossil solar power now is the cheapest source of power you're going to find anywhere. And I want to make quickly this final point. No house in Guyana, no household in Guyana should ever go to sleep in darkness. For $2,000, $5,000, you can provide basic lighting for almost any house in any part of this country. We have to have some fundamental rethink. Even we talk about a mile. I'm not sure that we need a mile anymore. I really am not sure. I agree with Melinda. We don't. As somebody
Project.
you have to spend money. You waste money. The more you spend, the more you waste. And we need to be careful. Our oil money must not only be for this generation, but succeeding generations. As must our environment, the most important thing, which is what this evening is all about.
Thank you very much, dear Ram. But I would like to just ask you a quick follow-up question, because you spoke about the contract and particularly this concerning provision about the stabilization clause or the stability clause. Can you tell us a little bit about who's really the creator for this sort of conundrum that we are seeing with the production sharing agreement? Because there have been so many versions. We've heard versions that the PPP was partly responsible. We've heard versions that Exxon might have had a hand. We've also heard versions that it was the APNU AFC administration that had made their own adjustments and taken it. But what have your investigations found?
The two critical model petroleum agreements are both PPP models, the Janet Jagan model and the Robert Prasad model. The 2016 agreement was based on the 2012 model agreement. We must not forget, when the PPP lost power, Robert Prasad went and was flirting with Raphael Trotman. We must not forget that.
Prasad was flirting with Trotman?
Robert Prasad.
Okay.
Yes. We must not forget that it is a PPP model agreement of 2012. Where Trotman went wrong. The 2012 agreement was a pre-discovery contract. When Trotman signed the agreement in 2016, we'd already had two major discoveries, or we had one confirmed and one on the verge of confirmation, but it had already been widely known. It's only the extent was known. Trotman signed a post-discovery, in a post-discovery environment, he attributed a pre-discovery contract. And so all the so-called risks, by the time the 2016 agreement had been signed, there was no more risk because oil had already been found. in substantial quantities to more than pay back the oil companies for their investment, which I have some serious doubt about. I have said that the figures are wrong. We have had so many years of government and so much money spent on audit, and we can't get a single statement. And all you have to do, go to the commercial registry, take the financial statements, add them up, and you'll see the figures that Trotman signed to do not match up with the oil company's own figures. So to answer your question, that the PPP is responsible for the extremely generous oil contracts that we have, except that Trotman conceptually and mistakenly applied a pre-production contract to a post-discovery situation.
So the only changes that the APNU AFC administration would have made would be changing 1% to 2%?
Yes.
Okay.
Essentially, in a column I had done, in a series of columns I'd done in the Sabbath News, I compared the provisions. Essentially, is that one, the one on the royal, and the so-called signing bonus. And we know that the signing bonus was not a signing bonus. It was the creation of a legal fund to defend Exxon's right to move from one bordering country to another bordering country, to protect ExxonMobil and to allow us to pay Australian and all kind of foreign people. Those were the main changes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Now, Miss Annette, you're still there, right? Hello?
Yes, Kiana, I'm here.
Great. So we're about to close off our program this evening, and the question that I'd like to start with for you is we've already examined that there are a lot of safeguards that are absent, especially as it relates to the need to protect the environment. Now, from your perspective, what would you like the current administration, and in particular, what safeguards would you call on the Vice President, Dr. Jagdeo, who's often referred to as the local oil boss, to ensure are in place to prove that we aren't sacrificing the environment in its entirety in the name of development?
Well, first of all, yes, you're right. I do hold Dr. Jagdeo in quite high esteem, because I've worked under his presidency in 2010 when he crafted the Guyana Mangrove Restoration Program, which incidentally, Kiana, has achieved its objective of making every single Guyanese very aware of the importance of mangroves, albeit a decade later. And I am aware that they are also looking at revising the National Mangrove Management Plan, which I think, again, is a good opportunity for us to have very robust, safeguards in that revised plan. In terms of your general question about safeguards, I would also want to come back to the whole issue of flaring and ask as well that the government should demand that Exxon's Liza 1 EIA has a independent study done on the impacts of their prolonged flaring, for example. That wasn't done. In terms of the wastewater study that was supposed to have been completed by now, I'm very keen to know when that will be completed and what the findings are. And hopefully, again, that will be done by an independent company not related to Exxon. So those are the three priorities I could think in terms of relevant to flaring and relevant to the mangroves removal as well going forward. And I want to say as well that I saw that the expanded LCDS is going to be inclusive of biodiversity, watersheds, and the blue economy. And the draft will be ready in July to go out to wider national consultations. And I think, again, that is going to give every Guyanese an opportunity, civil society especially, to have input. So as Melinda said earlier about us stop whining and taking some action, I really want to urge Guyanese, especially Guyanese who genuinely care about the environment, to really get involved and take part in these processes and have our collective voices be heard by our policymakers. So that would be it for me, and I apologize again profusely for my connectivity issues.
That's okay. Thank you very much for your response, Annette. Ms. Janke, I'd like to ask you as well, what safeguards would you call on the Vice President to ensure in place to prove that there's actually some semblance of care for the environment?
I don't think I would. I think I would say to the people of this country, stop relying on the politicians. They've done an absolutely rotten job. We've had 50 decades of so-called development, and all that has happened is that the country's wealth has been squandered and people are no better off. Article 36 says the well-being of the nation depends on clean air, clean water, preserving those things and the rich diversity. I want to see people insisting that the government obeys Article 36. Article 149J says that we have a right to a healthy environment. I want to see people insisting that the government complies with that. The state has to protect the environment for the benefit of present and future generations. Well, oil is incompatible with that because we now have an existential crisis that is called climate change, and the Vice President himself has said that climate change is an existential crisis. The Constitution says that the state must protect the environment through reasonable legislative and other measures designed to secure sustainable development and use of natural resources while promoting justifiable economic and social development. That's very clear. We move on now to a post-carbon economy where people can have free energy, and we use the wealth of this country to benefit everybody, not just a few. Where is the money from Guyana's gold or bauxite or diamonds or sugar or any asset that you can name in this country? We are an extremely rich country in natural resources, and every single year the money is squandered and it does not go down. It does not go to the people of this country. It goes to an elite. And Chris made an excellent point when he talked about starvation wages. You look at what people are paid in this country and you look at what the politicians pay themselves. You look at what they pay themselves. You look at the pensions they take. You look at their take-home pay. You look at the perks that they take. You look at the big vehicles that they want to run you off the road with when other people have to walk or ride bicycle and it's no longer even safe to do that. So I think we should stop saying we would like the politicians to do this, that, and the other, and actually call them to account as our elected servants sent there to do a job which is to look after the well-being of the people of this nation. It's not to make money. The business sector is supposed to make money. And they're not doing a particularly good job about enriching this country, although there may be a few business people who are extremely rich, but that's not the point. The job of the government is to take care of the people of this country and to ensure that everybody has enough to eat, has decent housing, has a right to education, has a life of dignity. And that's not my view. That's what the Constitution says. So if I was going to say anything to any government, I would say obey the supreme law of the country, which is the Constitution. And I would say to the population, get hold of this document and use it.
Thank you very much, Ms. Janke. Mr. Ram, you are closing off our program tonight. What are your thoughts? Do we ask the politicians to pay attention to some of the safeguards, or are there any safeguards that you want them to put in place, or is your position for them to head straight into paying attention to what the people have to say?
Well, you know, Melinda talked about trusting the politicians.
Yes.
I had an undertaking, a commitment by one of our politicians. Wait until we get back into power and we will renegotiate that evil contract. And what do we have? we have them making it even easier for ExxonMobil. We talk about the Constitution. Our Parliament is allowed to make laws for the peace, order, and good government of the country. We cannot make a law that is adverse to the interests of ExxonMobil because Trotman and Robert Prasad were prepared to sign that evil kind, or one initiate and the other one to sign that type of evil document. Until we assert our authority and our power, we have to get rid of that evil stability clause. We have to stop becoming the slave of the private sector. We had all this big talk about local content. The private sector start raising objections. When last you heard about local content, Kiana? You're not hearing anything anymore after spending millions and millions of dollars. We signed the SCAZU agreement,
Yes.
saying that, oh, everybody going to have access to information. Why didn't we, from the time we signed the agreement, it only came into operation because a certain number of people countries had to ratify it. We have had the Access to Information Act, must be about, what, at least 10 years ago. And do people have a right to information in this country? The answer is no. Absolutely, and a resounding no. So, with the government and the operator sharing information and keeping it in such a close-knit political grouping so that nobody, no petroleum commission, nobody like that can get their hands on information, I think the outlook in terms of the operation of the petroleum sector is not encouraging. And I want to say to people, don't you think that you're going to make any agreement that's going to run counter to the 2016 agreement. You can do what you want. You cannot lawfully do that. And Exxon, when it becomes necessary, when Exxon feels that their interest is adversely affected, Exxon can go to a sole export and they can go to arbitrator, and meanwhile everything is shelved. By that time they would have taken everything. Leave us, our fishing sector will have gone. We have abandoned assets in the offshore Guyana, and you know the big problem for us. This sounds like an abstract discussion. We talk about constitution, we talk about oil, and we talk. The trouble is we cannot see what's happening. We could have seen. We can see when the gold miners, they destroy the creeks and waterways. We're not seeing that destruction. We're not being allowed to go out there and take photographs. Even though that is all part of the territory of Guyana because it's part of our economic zone. Yet we're not allowed to go there. I'm not even sure that the EPA is allowed to go there. So I started by saying, I've long lost confidence. I'm beginning to lose hope, which is not a very good state to be in.
Okay. Thank you very much for your comments, Mr. Ram. And to the entire panel, thank you very much for making the time to share your perspectives on oil and the environment with our viewers. We had some pretty interesting comments. Before I go, I'll share one of the comments that we had here. And this is from Miss Clarkson. She's saying, this is a very brilliant conversation. Hopefully it can continue with a second part. We'll try to have the panelists back for another discussion because this is really something that we really need to have going. Another comment that we had is from Miss Rowena Ramlal. She said, this is a rich discussion, and as a young professional in natural resource management, I'm here tonight and every night taking notes. However, I want us to resist the urge to vilify the EPA. recognizing that the EPA might have been made headless by the current administration so that these very atrocities can continue unabated. Would any of the panelists, member of the panelists, like to respond to that?
Not I says Ram.
Okay. Well, with that, I'd like to thank you guys once again for being part of the discussion. Hopefully, once your schedule allows, we can be back here next week, Thursday, for part 2. To our viewers and all those who participated tonight in one way or the other, thank you very much for joining, and we do hope that you have a pleasant rest of the evening. Do continue to stay safe.
Keep up the great
Bye.
work,
Good
Kiana.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.